The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before Commander Sarah Chen as she stood on the flight deck of USS Theodore Roosevelt, one of the United States Navy's most powerful Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. The wind whipped across the steel expanse, carrying with it the salt-laden spray and the unmistakable scent of military precision. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the endless grid of aircraft, personnel, and weaponry that represented billions of dollars of American naval might. Yet despite the grandeur surrounding her, Chen felt profoundly alone. She had spent 15 years earning this moment. 15 years of sacrificing personal relationships, missing holidays with her aging parents, and proving herself repeatedly in a culture that had never truly welcomed women into its most exclusive circles. Her record was impeccable: commendations for valor, advanced certifications in naval operations, a PhD in strategic warfare, and the unqualified respect of everyone who had served beneath her command in previous assignments. The Navy's official press releases celebrated her appointment as historic and groundbreaking. Behind closed doors, however, a different narrative was already being constructed. Admiral Marcus Whitmore had been waiting for her in the officers' quarters that morning. He was a man of the old guard, 63 years old, with a career spanning 4 decades of unquestioned authority. His uniform displayed medals earned during the Cold War and the early days of American interventionism. His handshake, when they were formally introduced, was perfunctory and cold. Chen remembered every detail: the way his blue eyes narrowed, how his jaw clenched as he looked at her shoulder boards, the barely perceptible curl of his lip that suggested disgust rather than welcome. "Commander," he had said, his voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge of contempt. "Welcome aboard Theodore Roosevelt. I trust you understand the gravity of your position and the traditions you represent." Chen, always professional, had responded with military courtesy. "Thank you, Admiral. I'm honored to serve and committed to maintaining the highest operational standards." Whitmore had stared at her for a long moment before responding. "The Roosevelt has a legacy, Commander, a legacy built by men who understood the sacrifices required in combat command. I hope you're prepared to uphold that legacy." He had paused, letting the implication hang in the air between them. Some traditions shouldn't be changed simply because of political pressure. That evening, Chen sat alone in her quarters, replaying the conversation. She knew what Whitmore believed. He had made no secret of his views in previous interviews and off-the-record comments. Women in combat command positions were social experiments, he had stated publicly. They complicated the natural hierarchy of military command. Combat leadership required a certain type of aggression, an inherent toughness that he believed female biology could not match. He had never said these things directly to Chen, but he didn't need to. His contempt was as visible as the stars reflecting off the black ocean outside her window. What Chen didn't yet know was that Whitmore had already begun organizing her downfall. In his private quarters, he was meeting with his most trusted staff members, men who shared his views, men whose careers had been built on traditional military culture. They discussed Chen not as a commanding officer, but as a problem to be solved. Whitmore had made his intentions clear in conversations hidden from official record. "We need to document everything," he had told his inner circle. "Every decision she makes, every protocol she bends, every situation where she shows weakness or poor judgment. She'll make mistakes, they always do, and we'll be ready when she does. The Navy may have forced her on us, but I'll remove her before her tour is complete. I don't care what it takes." The conspiracy was sophisticated. Whitmore understood that he couldn't simply refuse to work with Chen or openly discriminate against her. That would be career suicide in an era of increasing scrutiny. Instead, he would use the system itself, the very regulations and protocols designed to ensure fair command, as a weapon against her. Every standard decision would be scrutinized. Every tactical judgment would be questioned. Ambiguous situations would be interpreted, in ways that reflected poorly on her competence. The plan had the backing of several other senior officers who believed as Whitmore did. Together, they represented a powerful informal network within the Pacific Fleet. These men had mentored junior officers, controlled promotions, and shaped Navy culture for decades. The idea that a woman, particularly a woman who wasn't a legacy, who hadn't gone to Annapolis, who had climbed the ranks through a combination of talent and grinding determination, should command the Roosevelt infuriated them on a fundamental level. As Chen gazed out at the darkening ocean that first night as commanding officer, she was unaware of the machinery already moving against her. She had prepared for professional challenges. She had anticipated skepticism from some quarters. What she didn't anticipate was the systematic, coordinated effort to destroy her career that was being quietly orchestrated in the highest levels of Pacific Fleet Command. Whitmore, standing in his own quarters aboard the Roosevelt, looked at a photograph on his wall, a picture of himself as a young ensign, surrounded by fellow officers, all men, all products of a culture that had remained essentially unchanged for 2 centuries. He removed the photo and replaced it with one showing the entire command staff, with Chen standing prominently in the center. He stared at her face in the image for a long moment, his expression hardening. "Not for long," he whispered to the empty room, "not for long." The stage was set. The admiral and the commander were now locked in a struggle neither could afford to lose. Chen was fighting for validation, for the right to prove that women could command at the highest levels of naval warfare. Whitmore was fighting for something he perceived as far more fundamental, the preservation of a military culture that reflected his understanding of power, authority, and American strength. Neither knew how far the other would be willing to go. Neither could predict how their collision would ripple through the Navy, shaking its foundations and forcing it to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, power, and the price of change. The Roosevelt cut through the Pacific waters that night, carrying with it 2 people on a collision course that would ultimately transform not just their careers, but the entire institution they served. 6 months transformed Commander Sarah Chen into something Admiral Whitmore had not anticipated, a legend. It was not the kind of legend that came from inherited privilege or family connections within the Navy's upper echelons. It was the hard-earned kind, built on countless decisions made under pressure, on sacrifices made for the people under her command, and on an unwavering commitment to excellence that inspired those around her to exceed their own limitations. The first 3 months were critical. Chen understood that every action, every word, every decision would be scrutinized by those who hoped she would fail. She approached her command with meticulous attention to detail, but more importantly, she approached it with genuine care for the 12,000 sailors and officers aboard the Roosevelt. She spent her days walking the carrier's corridors, from the flight deck to the engine room, from the combat information center to the galley. She learned names. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She recognized that the people who served under her weren't abstract units in a strategic equation, but complex human beings with fears, ambitions, and the capacity for extraordinary bravery. Word spread quickly. In the Navy, where information travels through informal networks as fast as official channels, Chen's accessibility became almost legendary. Junior enlisted sailors reported that the commanding officer had remembered their names from a single conversation weeks earlier. Officers described her tactical briefings as master classes in strategic thinking. Flight crews spoke of her presence on the flight deck during dangerous operations, not to micromanage, but to share the risks her people took. Admiral Whitmore watched this transformation with growing fury. He had prepared for incompetence. He had anticipated poor judgment. What he had not anticipated was competence paired with genuine leadership ability. Those elements made her far more dangerous to his plans. The crisis that changed everything began on a Tuesday morning in the South China Sea. Intelligence indicated that Chinese naval vessels were moving into waters nominally claimed by multiple countries in the region. The situation was delicate. Any aggressive action could provoke an international incident. Any passive response could signal weakness and encourage further encroachment. The Roosevelt Strike Group was positioned to respond, but the response had to be perfectly calibrated. Whitmore sent explicit orders to Chen: maintain a passive defensive posture, monitor the situation, do not take independent tactical action without explicit authorization. The order was detailed and unambiguous. Chen received it in her quarters at 300 hours. She studied the intelligence reports attached to Whitmore's directive for 6 hours, analyzing patterns, considering scenarios, running simulations in her mind. By 900 hours, Chen believed she had identified a critical flaw in Whitmore's strategy. The Admiral's plan would work if the Chinese fleet maintained its current course and speed, but their positioning suggested they might attempt to establish a blocking position that would limit American naval mobility in international waters. If they succeeded, it would represent a significant strategic victory, proof that they could constrain American operations in regions the United States had dominated for 70 years. Chen faced an impossible choice. She could follow Whitmore's orders precisely and potentially allow a situation to develop that would compromise American strategic interests. Or she could make an independent decision that, if it went wrong, would be viewed as insubordination by a commanding officer explicitly trying to build a case against her. She made her decision based not on career calculation, but on the duty she felt toward the sailors under her command and the nation she had sworn to protect. Chen ordered aggressive sonar sweeps of the contested waters. She repositioned 3 guided missile cruisers into tactical positions that would enable the strike group to respond rapidly to any Chinese movement. She coordinated with an attack submarine operating in the region, ensuring it was aware of the tactical situation. These actions violated Whitmore's explicit orders. They were also, as it turned out, precisely what the situation required. The Chinese vessels detected the American activity and recognized that their blocking maneuver had been anticipated. They altered course and withdrew from the contested waters. Within hours, the crisis had dissipated. No shots had been fired. No international incident had occurred. The American position had been strengthened without provocative action. Whitmore received Chen's report with his face turning colors that alarmed his staff officers. He read the message 3 times, looking for some way to interpret it as failure. He could find none. The tactical situation had been managed expertly. American interests had been protected. The operation had been a textbook success. But success was not what Whitmore wanted. He wanted evidence of her incompetence. He wanted justification for her removal. Instead, he received proof of her exceptional judgment. That evening, Whitmore called a private meeting with his most trusted officers. His voice was cold and controlled, but his hands trembled slightly, a sign of the fury barely contained within him. "Commander Chen disobeyed explicit orders today," he told them. "That's insubordination. That's a fundamental breach of the chain of command. I want this documented. I want every officer who worked under her orders to prepare statements. I want evidence of every decision she makes from this point forward. The fact that her disobedience happened to produce a favorable outcome is irrelevant. If we allow commanding officers to ignore orders whenever they believe they know better, we have no command structure at all." His logic was compelling, at least to those who shared his worldview. Whitmore had reframed Chen's exceptional judgment as a threat to military discipline. He had taken her greatest strength, the ability to make sound, independent decisions under pressure, and begun the process of transforming it into evidence of unfitness for command. Over the following months, Whitmore's team began constructing their narrative in earnest. Minor procedural variations were documented as violations. Tactical decisions that other commanders made routinely were scrutinized as questionable. Officers close to Whitmore began suggesting, in subtle ways, that perhaps the Admiral was right to be concerned about Chen's judgment. But something unexpected happened. The more Whitmore and his allies questioned Chen's decisions, the more the crew rallied around her. They had witnessed her leadership firsthand. They had seen her make difficult choices that prioritized their safety and America's strategic interests. They understood intuitively that she was being treated differently, that standards were being applied to her that were not applied to male commanders. The friction between Admiral Whitmore and Commander Chen became increasingly visible. It manifested in cold interactions during formal briefings, in Whitmore's obvious refusal to acknowledge her contributions during command meetings, and in the detailed criticisms he inserted into official reports about her performance. Chen felt the weight of it all. She understood that Whitmore was building a case against her. She recognized that no matter what she accomplished, no matter how successfully she led, the Admiral would find ways to interpret her actions as failures or signs of unfitness. 6 months into her command, Commander Sarah Chen had earned the respect of nearly everyone under her authority, but she had also earned the enmity of one of the Navy's most powerful figures. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would ultimately shake the institution to its foundations. The intelligence briefing arrived at 5:30 hours on a morning that would permanently alter the trajectory of Commander Sarah Chen's career. The classified documents bore the highest security classifications, their contents restricted to only the most senior officers in the Pacific Fleet. Chen reviewed them in her secure quarters aboard the Roosevelt, her coffee growing cold as she absorbed the information. A Russian intelligence vessel had been detected operating in international waters near a critical choke point through which American submarines regularly transited. The vessel was conducting surveillance operations, mapping sonar signatures, attempting to develop targeting profiles for American naval assets. The presence was a direct challenge to American superiority in the region. The situation was delicate because the Russian ship was technically in international waters. Any aggressive move could create a diplomatic incident, yet allowing the Russians to complete their surveillance mission would compromise American security. Admiral Whitmore's directive arrived 30 minutes after the intelligence briefing. His orders were explicit and detailed. Maintain current operational posture. Do not engage Russian vessel. Do not conduct operations that could be interpreted as aggressive. Monitor situation and report developments. All tactical decisions require explicit authorization from Fleet Command. Do not deviate from these orders under any circumstances. The capital letters at the end of the directive conveyed more than mere emphasis. They conveyed Whitmore's awareness that Chen might be tempted to act independently. They conveyed his determination to constrain her options. The orders were designed not just to manage the tactical situation, but to limit Chen's authority, to force her into a position where any independent action could be classified as insubordination. Chen studied the orders carefully, understanding their true purpose. But she also studied the intelligence reports, running scenarios through her mind, analyzing the tactical situation with the kind of detailed attention that had made her one of the Navy's most respected strategic minds. The Russian vessel's positioning had a particular significance that Whitmore's briefing had mentioned but not fully analyzed. The ship was not randomly surveilling American waters. Its specific coordinates and operational pattern suggested it was attempting to establish a persistent intelligence platform that could monitor American submarine movements through a critical waterway. If the Russians succeeded, they would gain targeting information that could compromise American submarine operations throughout the entire Pacific. Chen had 3 options. First, she could follow Whitmore's orders precisely, maintain her current position, and allow the Russian vessel to complete its surveillance mission. This approach was safe from a career perspective. She would have explicit authorization for her actions, or rather, her inactions. But it would result in a strategic loss for American interests. Second, she could wait for authorization from Whitmore before taking action. But authorization would take time, hours at minimum, possibly days. By the time Whitmore approved any response, the Russians might complete their mission or move beyond American response capability. Third, she could take independent action, using her judgment as the commanding officer on scene to respond to a tactical situation that was developing in real time. Chen understood the stakes of that third option. She knew that Whitmore was specifically looking for evidence of insubordination. She understood that any deviation from his explicit orders would be documented, analyzed, and used as evidence against her. She also understood that allowing the Russians to succeed in their intelligence mission would compromise American security in ways that might not become apparent for years. Not until submarines deployed into potentially hostile situations, lacking the tactical advantages that American technical superiority usually provided. At 800 hours, Chen made her decision. She ordered her communications officer to prepare a message to Whitmore. Admiral, tactical analysis indicates Russian vessel is establishing persistent intelligence platform in critical chokepoint. Recommend immediate engagement with electronic countermeasures and tactical repositioning to disrupt surveillance mission. Request authorization to proceed. The message was respectful. It informed Whitmore of her assessment. It requested authorization. It gave him the opportunity to approve or deny her recommended action. Whitmore's response came back within 15 minutes. Maintain current posture. Do not engage Russian vessel. Await further orders. At that moment, Chen made a decision that would define her career. She would follow not the letter of Whitmore's order but the spirit of her duty as a commanding officer. She interpreted her authority to manage the tactical situation as providing latitude to make operational decisions designed to protect American interests. She ordered the Roosevelt to conduct a series of electronic warfare exercises. These exercises were entirely legitimate. They were routine training operations that any carrier strike group might conduct at any time. The exercises just happened to occur in the exact location where the Russian vessel was conducting its surveillance. The electronic signals generated by the American exercises were so powerful and so complex that they overwhelmed the Russian ship's surveillance equipment. The Russian vessel's sensors were effectively blinded. The surveillance mission became impossible to conduct. Simultaneously, Chen ordered 3 guided missile cruisers to conduct navigation exercises that took them uncomfortably close to the Russian vessel, close enough to be threatening, but not so close as to constitute a direct challenge. The message was unmistakable. You are not welcome here, and American forces can respond to your presence with overwhelming capability. Within 6 hours, the Russian vessel altered course and withdrew from the contested waters. The surveillance mission was abandoned. American interests were protected. No shots had been fired. No diplomatic incident had occurred. Whitmore received Chen's report at 14:30 hours that afternoon. He read it 3 times, his face darkening with each reading. The report was technically truthful. Chen had conducted electronic warfare exercises and navigation drills, all authorized operational activities. Nowhere did she state that these exercises had been specifically designed to disrupt Russian intelligence operations. The report was careful, professional, and completely insubordinate in its spirit. At 1600 hours, Admiral Whitmore initiated a formal inquiry into Chen's actions. At 1800 hours, he convened a meeting with his legal advisors. At 2000 hours, he sat alone in his quarters, drafting the document that would alter everything. The next morning, a messenger delivered an official memorandum to Commander Chen's quarters. The letterhead bore Admiral Whitmore's signature. The language was formal, bureaucratic, and devastating. Chen read the words with growing disbelief. Effective immediately, Commander Sarah Chen is relieved of command of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. This action is taken due to persistent failures to follow explicit orders, questionable tactical judgment, and inability to maintain proper deference to chain of command authority. Commander Chen will report to Naval Base Pearl Harbor for reassignment to administrative duties, effective immediately. The document was 7 paragraphs long. Each paragraph documented tactical decisions that other commanders made routinely, reinterpreted as violations of protocol. The incident with the Russian vessel was characterized not as successful tactical management, but as unauthorized engagement with hostile forces despite explicit orders to maintain passive posture. Chen sat on her bunk, holding the memorandum in her hands, feeling as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. She had saved American lives. She had protected American interests. She had made exactly the kind of decision that commanding officers were supposed to make when confronted with real-time tactical situations. And she was being exiled for it. The Roosevelt's crew would learn the news within hours. Word would spread through the ship like an electrical current. And in the quarters of junior officers and enlisted sailors who had come to respect Chen deeply, a different narrative was already beginning to form, one that would ultimately challenge everything Admiral Marcus Whitmore had carefully constructed. Captain David Rodriguez sat in the cramped quarters of USS Pennsylvania, a Lowe's Angels-class nuclear submarine operating at periscope depth 200 miles off the coast of San Diego. The submarine was conducting routine surveillance operations, maintaining silent watch on a contested region of the Pacific. The crew moved through the narrow corridors with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to exist in spaces barely larger than closets, breathing recycled air, and living with the constant awareness that they were thousands of feet below the surface of an unforgiving ocean. Rodriguez was reviewing tactical reports when his communications officer, Lieutenant James Warren, approached with a classified message. The officer's face was pale. His hands trembled slightly as he handed Rodriguez the document. Something in the message was affecting Warren emotionally, unusual for a man trained to maintain composure under pressure. "Sir," Warren said quietly, "you'll want to read this. It's being transmitted throughout the fleet." Rodriguez opened the message. It took him 30 seconds to process the information. Then he read it again, hoping the words would somehow change, would somehow reveal different meaning. They did not. The memorandum detailed Commander Sarah Chen's immediate removal from command of USS Theodore Roosevelt. It cited failure to follow explicit orders and questionable tactical judgment as the grounds for her reassignment. She was being transferred to a shore-based administrative position in Hawaii, effective immediately. Rodriguez felt something break inside his chest. He closed his eyes, remembering the woman who had changed the trajectory of his military career. 3 years earlier, Rodriguez had been serving aboard the Roosevelt under Chen's predecessor, an officer who ran the ship with rigid authoritarianism and contempt for the people under his command. Rodriguez had been a competent but unremarkable junior officer, lacking the kind of aggressive confidence that senior commanders rewarded. When Chen had assumed command, everything changed. She had recognized something in Rodriguez that others had missed, not just capability, but potential. She had mentored him through difficult situations, challenged him to think more strategically, pushed him to develop leadership skills that extended beyond technical competence. More importantly, she had shown him that authority could be exercised with both strength and humanity, that a commanding officer could demand excellence while still caring about the people who served under her. Rodriguez had left the Roosevelt 2 years earlier for submarine command training. His assignment to USS Pennsylvania had been the culmination of everything Chen had helped him achieve. He had earned his command through her mentorship and encouragement. He owed his career trajectory to her belief in his abilities. And now she was being exiled. Rodriguez made his way to the submarine's control center. The crew members he passed noticed something in his expression, a tension, a fury barely contained. The submarine's commanding officer was not a man prone to emotional displays, but the message he had just received had shattered his professional composure. Chief of Boat Marcus Sullivan was standing near the periscope station when Rodriguez entered the control room. Sullivan had served under Chen on the Roosevelt before transferring to the Pennsylvania. He had also received the message about her reassignment. The two men's eyes met for a moment, a silent understanding passing between them. "I assume you've seen the transmission, Chief," Rodriguez said quietly. "Yes, sir," Sullivan replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The crew is talking about it. They're asking questions about how something like this can happen." The crew, that was the real problem. Half of the Pennsylvania's sailors had served under Chen at some point in their careers. To them, she wasn't an abstraction or a statistic in military bureaucracy. She was a commanding officer who had earned their respect through demonstrated leadership, competence, and genuine concern for their welfare. They understood, in the way that sailors always understand such things, that Chen was being treated differently, that standards were being applied to her that would never be applied to male officers. Rodriguez stood silently in the control center, feeling the weight of command pressing down on him. He understood the implications of what he was considering. As a submarine commander, he operated under protocols that were perhaps more restrictive than anywhere else in the Navy. Nuclear submarines were deemed so dangerous, so strategically important, that their operations were controlled through explicit orders and standing directives. Admiral Whitmore had issued standing orders to USS Pennsylvania, remain submerged and undetected during current operational deployment. The order made tactical sense. An undetected submarine was far more valuable than one whose position had been revealed. But those orders had been issued before Chen's reassignment. Those orders had been issued in a different context. Rodriguez made his decision in the silence of his own mind, without consulting anyone, without seeking advice or permission. He understood exactly what surfacing the submarine would mean. It would be a direct violation of Admiral Whitmore's standing orders. It would be an act of insubordination that could cost him his command, his career, possibly his freedom. Courts-martial had been ordered for less obvious violations of explicit orders. But some things, Rodriguez understood, transcended career considerations. Some moments in a military career defined what kind of officer, what kind of man, you actually were. This was such a moment. "Contact sonar," Rodriguez ordered. "Mark the position of the carrier strike group." The sonar officer responded immediately. "Strike group bearing 010, range 185 miles, sir." Rodriguez studied the tactical display, plotting the submarine's current position relative to the carrier group. The distances worked. The geography worked. The timing would work. "Helm," he said quietly, "set course to intercept the carrier strike group. All ahead full." The helmsman hesitated for just a moment. "Sir, that course will bring us into the carrier's operational zone. Admiral Whitmore's orders specify." "I'm aware of the Admiral's orders, helmsman. Set the course as directed." The submarine accelerated, cutting through the Pacific waters with the power of its nuclear reactor driving it forward. Rodriguez watched the tactical display as USS Pennsylvania moved toward the carrier strike group. Chief Sullivan stood beside him, understanding what was about to happen, understanding the implications. "Sir," Sullivan said quietly, "if you surface that boat in the middle of the strike group's operational zone, there will be questions. There will be investigations." "I know, Chief," Rodriguez replied. "That's exactly the point. Sometimes the system needs to be forced to confront its own injustices. Sometimes you have to create a crisis big enough that people can't ignore it." As USS Pennsylvania moved through the Pacific depths, its crew began to understand that something extraordinary was about to happen. The normal patterns of submarine operation were being abandoned. The standing orders were being violated. Captain Rodriguez was making a choice that would either redeem his career and force the Navy to address systemic bias, or destroy everything he had worked for. The submarine continued its course toward the carrier strike group, carrying with it a captain's defiance and the hopes of everyone who had ever served under Sarah Chen's command. Periscope depth, Captain David Rodriguez commanded, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would echo through the Navy for years to come. The submarine's depth control operator immediately began adjusting ballast tanks, bringing USS Pennsylvania upward through the black depths toward the surface. The boat rose with the grace of a whale breaching, tons of steel and nuclear power ascending toward the light. In the Combat Information Center aboard USS Theodore Roosevelt, radar operators were conducting routine surveillance sweeps of the surrounding waters. The carrier strike group maintained constant vigilance, monitoring for threats, tracking commercial traffic, aware of every significant object moving through their operational zone. The protocols were strict, the procedures refined through decades of Cold War experience and post-9/11 vigilance. At 13:47 hours, something appeared on the radar displays that should not have been there. A submarine signature, a Lowe's Angels-class attack boat, moving directly into the heart of the carrier strike group's operational zone. The radar operators stared at their screens in disbelief. Submarines operated covertly. They surfaced only in emergencies or when ordered to do so. No submarine commander would voluntarily sacrifice the tactical advantage of stealth by bringing his boat to the surface in the middle of an active carrier strike group. Yet that is precisely what Captain Rodriguez was doing. "Surface the boat," Rodriguez said again, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable finality. "All hands to surface stations. Maintain operational readiness." The submarine's hull broke the surface of the Pacific Ocean with a tremendous eruption of water. USS Pennsylvania rose from the depths like something mythological, seawater cascading off its black hull, the conning tower emerging into the sunlight. For the first time in weeks, the boat's crew felt fresh air, salt-laden, cool, carrying the scent of the open ocean rather than recycled submarine atmosphere. In the Combat Information Center aboard Theodore Roosevelt, chaos erupted. Officers shouted over one another, trying to process what their instruments were telling them. A nuclear submarine had surfaced directly within the strike group's defensive perimeter. It was a violation of everything the Navy understood about operational security. It was a direct challenge to Admiral Whitmore's explicit standing orders. "Sound General Quarters," Admiral Whitmore commanded from his command center. His voice was ice-cold fury barely contained. "I want to know who authorized that submarine to surface and why. I want an explanation immediately." Officers scrambled to establish contact with USS Pennsylvania. The communications officer aboard the submarine responded with a simple message. "USS Pennsylvania surfaced in international waters at your current location. Awaiting orders. Standing by for communication with Strike Group Command." The message was correct procedurally. It offered no explanation. It provided no justification. It simply stated a fact. The submarine was here at the surface in direct defiance of standing orders. Aboard USS Pennsylvania, Rodriguez stood in the sail, the submarine's conning tower, with his eyes fixed on the distant outline of the aircraft carrier. Binoculars would have made the Roosevelt more visible, but Rodriguez didn't need magnification. He knew the ship. He had served aboard her. He could feel her presence across the ocean's surface. His executive officer, Commander James Mitchell, climbed up to join him in the sail. Mitchell's face was pale. He understood what Rodriguez had just done. He understood the magnitude of the violation. "Captain," Mitchell said carefully, "Admiral Whitmore is demanding an explanation. He's asking why you surfaced the boat. He's asking if there's an emergency situation that warranted breaking standing orders." "Tell him we surfaced due to a matter of critical importance to fleet leadership," Rodriguez replied. Tell him we're standing by to provide additional detail if authorized." "Sir, that's not going to satisfy him. He's going to demand specifics. He's going to do exactly what I hope he does," Rodriguez interrupted. "He's going to investigate. He's going to ask questions. And when he asks those questions, people are going to have to tell the truth about why Commander Chen was relieved of command." Mitchell understood then. The submarine surfacing was not a military action. It was a political gesture, a signal so visible, so undeniable, that it would force the Navy's higher command to confront the situation that had just unfolded. News of USS Pennsylvania's surface breach spread through the fleet with the speed of wildfire. Other submarine commanders received the information with shock and confusion. Every commanding officer understood the implicit rules of submarine warfare and operations. You remained undetected. You followed orders. You did not surface in the middle of an active strike group's operational zone simply because you disagreed with something happening at the command level. Except that's exactly what Rodriguez had just done. The media, always alert to anything involving naval operations, immediately sensed a story. Reporters stationed near military bases received phone calls from officers willing to provide information. Within hours, news organizations were running headlines about an unexplained submarine surface incident in the Pacific. Questions were being asked. Journalists were demanding explanations from Navy spokespersons. Admiral Whitmore's staff scrambled to manage the narrative. The official statement claimed that USS Pennsylvania's surface maneuver was routine and that there were no operational concerns. But the explanation fell apart immediately when reporters asked the obvious question. If the maneuver was routine, why had it resulted in general quarters being sounded aboard the Roosevelt? Why had it generated urgent communications up the chain of command? Aboard the Pentagon, senior Navy officials were receiving emergency briefings about the incident. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted answers. The Secretary of the Navy was being asked by congressional liaisons why a nuclear submarine had engaged in what appeared to be an act of insubordination. Rodriguez remained in the sail of USS Pennsylvania, watching the Roosevelt through the late afternoon light. He knew that his career was likely over. He knew that courts-martial proceedings might await him. He knew that he had violated explicit orders in a way that was difficult to justify through any conventional military interpretation. But he also knew that he had done something that needed to be done. He had forced the system to confront its own corruption. He had made it impossible for Whitmore to quietly bury the truth about Chen's reassignment. Chief Sullivan appeared in the sail beside Rodriguez. The chief of boat carried something in his hand, a message that had just been transmitted to the submarine. Rodriguez read it, and a slight smile crossed his face. The message was from a senator on the Armed Services Committee. It read, "Captain Rodriguez, your actions have brought important matters to the attention of Congress. We have serious questions about the recent reassignment of Commander Chen. Await further instruction." The chess piece had been moved. The game was no longer being played on Admiral Whitmore's board. It was now being played on a much larger stage, one where the Admiral's power was considerably limited. As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, USS Pennsylvania maintained its position on the surface, its presence a constant, undeniable statement about the corruption festering within the Navy's highest levels of command. Captain David Rodriguez had surfaced his submarine not as a military maneuver, but as an act of moral defiance. And in doing so, he had set in motion events that would transform the Navy itself. The interrogation room aboard USS Theodore Roosevelt was small, windowless, and designed to make the occupant feel isolated and vulnerable. Admiral Marcus Whitmore sat behind a metal table, flanked by his legal advisor and his chief of staff. The room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the Admiral's face, emphasizing the fury etched into every line. Across from him sat Captain David Rodriguez, still in his submarine command uniform, his hands resting calmly on the table before him. "Explain yourself, Captain," Whitmore said, his voice trembling with controlled rage. "Explain why you violated my explicit standing orders. Explain why you surfaced a nuclear submarine in the middle of this strike group's operational zone. Explain why you've created what is rapidly becoming a public relations catastrophe for the Navy." Rodriguez met Whitmore's eyes without flinching. "Admiral, USS Pennsylvania surfaced due to urgent tactical considerations that required immediate communication with Strike Group Command. The maneuver was executed according to emergency protocols and—" "Don't patronize me," Whitmore interrupted, his fist striking the table. "I'm not interested in generic explanations and bureaucratic language. I want to know specifically what tactical consideration justified breaking standing orders. I want to know who authorized this action. I want to know what you were thinking when you made the decision to surface that boat." The legal advisor, a sharp-eyed Navy judge advocate named Captain Patricia Stone, leaned forward. She recognized dangerous territory when she saw it. An admiral interrogating a subordinate officer about orders and authorization was creating a paper trail. Whatever Rodriguez said, or didn't say, would become part of the official record. "Admiral," Stone said carefully, "I would recommend conducting this inquiry through proper channels with appropriate documentation and representation for Captain Rodriguez." Whitmore ignored his legal advisor. His attention was entirely focused on Rodriguez. "Who told you to surface that submarine? Was it someone on my staff? Was it someone from Pacific Fleet Command? Who authorized this insubordination?" Rodriguez chose his words carefully. "Admiral, I made the decision to surface USS Pennsylvania based on my assessment of the tactical situation and my judgment as commanding officer. No one authorized the action. I took full responsibility for the decision." "That's not an answer," Whitmore said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That's evasion. You're telling me that you independently decided to violate my standing orders without consultation with anyone, without authorization from any superior officer. You're telling me that you made a unilateral decision that compromised operational security and created a security incident of significant proportions." "Yes, sir," Rodriguez replied. "I made the decision based on my assessment of what was required at that moment." Whitmore stared at him for a long moment. The admiral was intelligent enough to recognize that Rodriguez was being truthful, and also intelligent enough to recognize that the truthfulness was creating problems rather than solving them. If Rodriguez had acted on his own authority, then the incident couldn't be traced to anyone else in the chain of command. If Rodriguez had been ordered to surface the submarine, that would indicate conspiracy at higher levels. Neither scenario was acceptable to Whitmore, but the independent decision scenario was worse because it meant that a junior commanding officer had felt empowered to violate explicit orders. "This conversation is over," Whitmore said, standing abruptly. "You will remain aboard this vessel pending a formal investigation into your actions. You are relieved of command of USS Pennsylvania, effective immediately. Your executive officer, Commander Mitchell, assumes command. Is that understood, Captain?" "Understood, sir," Rodriguez replied calmly. Within 6 hours, the Navy's official explanation for USS Pennsylvania's surface maneuver had been released to the media. The statement indicated that the submarine had surfaced due to routine equipment maintenance procedures, and that all standing orders were followed appropriately. The statement was immediately contradicted by multiple sources, who provided reporters with information that standing orders had explicitly required the submarine to remain submerged. Cable news networks were running constant coverage of what was being called the submarine incident. Military analysts debated the tactical implications. Former Navy officers appeared on television questioning why a Lowe's Angels-class submarine would surface in the middle of an active carrier, Strike Group's operational zone for routine maintenance. At the Pentagon, Senior officers were receiving emergency briefings. Admiral James Chen, no relation to Commander Sarah Chen, the commander of Pacific Fleet, was being asked difficult questions by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. How had a subordinate commanding officer felt empowered to violate explicit orders? What did this indicate about command structure integrity? Why was there conflicting information about the incident in official Navy communications? In congressional offices on Capitol Hill, staffers were receiving urgent messages from Navy officers willing to leak information. One staffer, Jennifer Morrison, worked for Senator Patricia Liu, who had been instrumental in supporting Commander Chen's original assignment to the Roosevelt. Morrison was reviewing classified briefings that detailed the exact timeline of Chen's reassignment and the circumstances surrounding it. "This is it," Morrison said to herself, reading through the documents late into the night. "This is the evidence we need." She immediately contacted her senator. Within hours, Senator Liu was requesting classified briefings about both Commander Chen's reassignment and Captain Rodriguez's submarine incident. The senator's questions were polite but pointed. What were the specific grounds for Commander Chen's relief from command? Why did those grounds seem inconsistent with how other commanders' similar decisions were handled? Could the Navy provide documentation of disciplinary actions against male commanding officers who had made comparable independent tactical decisions? The Pentagon's legal department was receiving questions it wasn't prepared to answer. The documentation supporting Chen's reassignment was suddenly revealing itself to be less solid upon close examination. Her tactical decisions, when compared to those of other commanders, didn't appear to violate standards. They appeared to exceed them. Admiral Whitmore's investigation into Rodriguez's actions was becoming increasingly complicated. Officers who were interviewed began revealing information about the Admiral's documented bias against women in command. Several officers reported conversations in which Whitmore had expressed his views about female commanders being unsuitable for combat positions. One particularly damning piece of testimony came from a senior officer who reported that Whitmore had explicitly stated his intention to remove Commander Chen, regardless of her performance. The investigation that Whitmore had initiated, intended to justify his actions and pin responsibility on Rodriguez, was instead becoming an investigation into Whitmore himself. News organizations were now running stories with headlines like "Navy Admiral's Bias May Have Led to Submarine Officers' Actions," and questions about female commanders' removal prompt congressional inquiry. Reporters were interviewing sailors who had served under Chen, all of whom provided consistent testimony about her exceptional leadership and competence. Captain Patricia Stone, Whitmore's legal advisor, approached him in his quarters with grim news. Her face was pale. Her demeanor indicated that she was bearing information the Admiral did not want to hear. "Sir," she said carefully, "our legal review of the evidence against Commander Chen has revealed significant problems. The documentation supporting her removal appears to be selective. When we compare her performance metrics to those of comparable male commanders, her record is significantly superior. The grounds cited for her removal would likely not have resulted in disciplinary action if applied to a male officer." Whitmore's hands clenched into fists. "That's not relevant to the legal question. The question is whether she violated orders." "Yes, sir," Stone replied. "But the question that Congress and the media are asking is whether she was treated differently because of her gender, and the evidence is increasingly suggesting that she was." In his quarters that night, Admiral Whitmore understood that his carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. The investigation he had initiated to justify his actions was instead becoming evidence of his bias. Captain Rodriguez's defiance had forced the system to confront uncomfortable truths. And somewhere in Hawaii, Commander Sarah Chen was waiting, not knowing that her exile was about to be reversed, not knowing that her vindication was coming, not knowing that a submarine captain's act of defiance was about to change everything. The investigation into Admiral Marcus Whitmore's conduct was officially launched on a Friday morning when the Navy's Inspector General received a classified briefing from congressional staff members. The briefing detailed allegations of gender-based discrimination, abuse of authority, and potential violations of military law. The Inspector General, a no-nonsense admiral named Catherine Walsh, read through the materials with growing concern. Walsh had spent 30 years in the Navy, and she understood the institution's culture intimately. She also understood that systemic bias didn't announce itself through grand gestures. It operated through subtle mechanisms, through networks of men protecting men, through standards applied inconsistently, through narratives that justified exclusion. What she was reading suggested that Admiral Whitmore had engineered all of these mechanisms in a coordinated effort to remove a competent commanding officer, primarily because of her gender. The investigation began with interviews of officers who had served under both Whitmore and Chen. The testimony was remarkably consistent. Officers described witnessing Whitmore make dismissive comments about female commanders. They reported being asked to identify procedural violations in Chen's reports that would never have been flagged in comparable reports filed by male commanders. Several officers provided written statements detailing conversations in which Whitmore had explicitly stated his belief that women were unsuited for combat command. One particularly damaging interview was with Commander Robert Martinez, a senior operations officer who had worked directly under Whitmore. Martinez had served alongside Chen for months and had observed how Whitmore treated her differently from male commanding officers. Under oath, Martinez testified, "I witnessed the Admiral apply different standards to Commander Chen than he applied to other commanding officers. When male commanders made independent tactical decisions, the Admiral often praised their initiative. When Commander Chen made identical decisions, he questioned her judgment. I believe the Admiral's treatment of Commander Chen was motivated by her gender, not by legitimate command concerns." The investigation expanded to include a detailed analysis of Chen's official record compared to other commanders' records. The Navy's legal department conducted a comprehensive review of how tactical decisions similar to Chen's were handled across the Pacific Fleet. The results were damning. In 73 cases over the previous 5 years, male commanding officers had made independent decisions that deviated from explicit orders. In 72 of those cases, the officer's actions were either praised or ignored. In one case, a commanding officer's decision to deviate from orders had resulted in promotion. Only in Chen's case had deviation from orders been used as justification for removal from command. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was unmistakable. Any objective reviewer could see that Chen had been subjected to standards that were not applied to male officers in comparable situations. Meanwhile, media attention to the story was intensifying. Major newspapers were running investigative pieces about gender bias in the Navy. Television networks featured interviews with sailors who had served under Chen, all of whom described her as an exceptional commanding officer. One particularly powerful interview featured a 22-year-old ensign who broke down in tears while describing how Commander Chen had mentored him through a family crisis and helped him become a better officer. "She cared about us," the ensign said on camera. "She didn't just see us as units in a military structure. She saw us as people, and Admiral Whitmore removed her because he didn't think women belonged in command. That's not how the Navy should work." Congressional pressure became impossible to ignore. Senator Patricia Liu, along with 4 other senators on the Armed Services Committee, sent a formal letter to the Secretary of the Navy demanding an explanation for Commander Chen's reassignment. The letter included specific questions about how her performance compared to other commanders and whether gender had been a factor in the decision to remove her. Within the Navy's highest levels, there was growing recognition that Chen's reassignment had been a catastrophic error. The Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Thomas Richardson, called a private meeting with Admiral Whitmore. The conversation was not friendly. "Marcus, you've created a disaster," Richardson said without preamble. "The evidence supporting Chen's removal is falling apart. The evidence of bias against her is overwhelming. Congress is asking questions we can't answer. The media is making the Navy look like it's operating under 19th century attitudes about women. You need to understand the severity of what you've done." Whitmore's response was defensive. "Sir, I removed her based on legitimate command concerns. She violated explicit orders. That's grounds for removal by any standard." "But she's not the only commanding officer who violated orders," Richardson replied coldly. "The difference is that every other officer who did so was treated differently. That's the problem. That's what the investigation is finding, and that difference is based on gender." The secretary paused, letting his words settle. "You're going to write a memo recommending that Commander Chen's reassignment be reversed, effective immediately. You're going to do this voluntarily before the investigation becomes even more public. You're going to frame it as a reconsideration based on new analysis of the tactical situation, and you're going to do this today." Whitmore's face went white. "Sir, that would be admitting that I made a mistake." "You did make a mistake," Richardson said flatly. "A massive, career-ending mistake. The only question now is how much additional damage you want to inflict before you acknowledge it." Whitmore left the secretary's office understanding that his career was over. He could fight the investigation, but fighting would only prolong the process and generate more damaging evidence. He could retire quietly and hope that history would be kind, but the investigation would continue regardless of his retirement. His only choice was to minimize the damage by cooperating. Within hours, an official Navy memorandum was transmitted through classified channels. The message informed Commander Sarah Chen that her reassignment had been reversed. She was being restored to her command position aboard USS Theodore Roosevelt, effective immediately. The memorandum cited new analysis of the tactical situation as the justification, carefully avoiding any explicit acknowledgement of bias or discrimination. In Hawaii, Sarah Chen received the message in her temporary quarters. She read it 3 times, hardly believing the words. She was being reinstated. The exile was over. She would return to her ship and her crew. The investigation into Admiral Whitmore continued for another 6 weeks. It documented a systematic pattern of bias, discrimination, and abuse of authority. The findings were damning and comprehensive, but before the full report could be released, Admiral Whitmore submitted his retirement request, effective in 90 days. His official statement read, "After careful consideration, I have decided that it is in the best interests of the Navy for me to retire at this time. I am grateful for my 38 years of service and look forward to the next chapter of my life." The statement was brief, professional, and completely hollow. Everyone understood the truth. Whitmore was retiring to avoid courts-martial and formal disciplinary proceedings. Captain David Rodriguez also faced consequences for surfacing USS Pennsylvania. He was brought before a formal review board to explain his actions, but the context had completely changed. The board now understood that Rodriguez had surfaced the submarine specifically to force the Navy to confront Whitmore's abuse of authority. In the context of that understanding, his violation of standing orders was reinterpreted as an act of moral courage rather than insubordination. The review board's decision was carefully worded. While Captain Rodriguez's actions technically violated standing orders, the board recognizes that his decision was motivated by legitimate concerns about command integrity. No further disciplinary action is recommended. In reality, Rodriguez was commended for his willingness to challenge corruption. The submarine community, which traditionally valued obedience above all else, quietly acknowledged that sometimes challenging orders was the right thing to do. Commander Chen returned to USS Theodore Roosevelt to a hero's welcome. The crew lined the deck when she came aboard. Officers saluted with evident respect. The message was unmistakable. The Navy's personnel understood justice when they saw it. The cascade of events set in motion by a submarine captain's decision to surface his boat in defiance of an admiral's orders was reshaping the Navy's culture. The institution was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, discrimination, and the abuse of power. And at the center of it all was Commander Sarah Chen, vindicated, restored, and ready to continue the work of transforming the Navy into something better than it had been. Admiral Marcus Whitmore's final day in uniform came on a gray morning in April, 3 months after his retirement request had been processed. There was no official ceremony, no parade of officers, no formal recognition of his 38 years of service. Instead, he departed Naval Base San Diego quietly, carrying 2 boxes of personal effects from his quarters. A handful of junior officers, men who owed him no favors and felt no loyalty, were present to witness his departure. The contrast between his exit and what should have been his retirement could not have been more stark. Officers of Whitmore's rank and service record typically departed to honor ceremonies, dinners celebrating their contributions, testimonials about their leadership. Whitmore received none of these things. The Navy had moved on, eager to distance itself from the scandal his conduct had generated. In the weeks following his retirement, the complete investigation into Whitmore's conduct was finally released to the public. The report was 287 pages long, meticulously documented, and devastating in its conclusions. It detailed a pattern of gender-based discrimination spanning years. It documented how Whitmore had used his authority to punish officers, particularly female officers, who challenged his worldview. It revealed conversations in which Whitmore had expressed explicit bias against women in combat command positions. Most damaging was the report's conclusion. The evidence demonstrates that Admiral Whitmore's decision to relieve Commander Chen of command was motivated primarily by gender-based bias rather than legitimate command concerns. Had Commander Chen been male, her identical tactical decisions would have resulted in commendation rather than removal. The report recommended a comprehensive investigation into other female officers' careers to determine whether they had been subjected to similar bias. It suggested that the Navy's culture of excluding women from senior command positions might be more extensive than previously acknowledged. News of the report's findings spread rapidly through military and civilian media. Major newspapers ran editorials about gender bias in the military. Television commentators debated how an institution as large and professional as the Navy could harbor such obvious discrimination at the highest levels. The story became a case study in how bias operates, not always through overt hostility, but through subtle mechanisms of power that accumulate into systemic exclusion. The political response was swift. Congressional representatives from both parties called for comprehensive reforms to the Navy's command structure. Senators introduced legislation requiring diversity training and bias audits across all military branches. The Navy, desperate to demonstrate that it was addressing the problem, established a task force dedicated to examining gender equity in command positions. Admiral Thomas Richardson, the Secretary of the Navy, held a press conference to announce sweeping changes to Navy policy. He acknowledged that the institution had failed to live up to its ideals of meritocracy and fairness. He committed to implementing systematic reforms designed to ensure that officers were evaluated based on competence rather than gender. Most significantly, he appointed Commander Sarah Chen to chair the Navy's newly created task force on command equity, making her the officer responsible for implementing the very reforms that Whitmore's conduct had necessitated. Chen accepted the position with characteristic professionalism. In her first public statement, she spoke carefully about the importance of institutional change. The Navy is fundamentally strong, but that strength comes from our people, from the sailors, officers, and civilians who serve with dedication and excellence. When we exclude talented people based on gender or any other characteristic unrelated to competence, we weaken ourselves. I'm honored to have the opportunity to help ensure that the Navy becomes the meritocracy it claims to be. Her words became widely quoted in military and civilian media. She was interviewed by major news organizations. She appeared before congressional committees. She became the public face of the Navy's commitment to addressing gender bias. But perhaps more importantly, she returned to command USS Theodore Roosevelt. When Commander Chen walked back onto the flight deck of the Roosevelt, the entire ship's complement seemed to line the railings. Sailors saluted. Officers stood at attention. The crew's welcome was emotional, powerful, and unmistakable in its message. They understood what had happened, and they supported their commanding officer. In the months that followed, Chen's second tour as commanding officer of the Roosevelt became legendary within the Navy. She used her platform to mentor junior female officers, showing them that advancement to the highest levels of command was possible. She implemented policies designed to create a more inclusive command environment. She took every opportunity to publicly affirm that the Navy's strength came from diversity and that exclusionary attitudes had no place in modern military culture. The Navy's Personnel Board, recognizing her exceptional leadership and the courage she had displayed in the face of institutional bias, advanced her promotion timeline. Within 18 months of her restoration to command, Sarah Chen was promoted to Rear Admiral. She became the highest-ranking woman in Pacific Fleet operations, a position that would have been unimaginable under Whitmore's watch. Captain David Rodriguez's career took a different trajectory, but one equally significant. His act of defiance, surfacing USS Pennsylvania in violation of explicit orders, became a defining moment in his professional identity. Rather than being viewed as insubordination, it was increasingly understood as an act of moral courage. The submarine community, traditionally the most conservative and hierarchical of military subcultures, began openly discussing Rodriguez's decision as an example of ethical leadership. Rodriguez was promoted to Commodore and assigned to oversee submarine operations training. He used his position to emphasize that true leadership sometimes required challenging orders when those orders were unjust or based on bias. He became a mentor to junior submarine officers, teaching them that the highest loyalty was not to individual commanders, but to the principles that the Navy claimed to represent. 3 years after the events of the submarine incident, the Navy released a comprehensive report on gender equity in command structures. The report documented significant progress. The percentage of female commanding officers had doubled. The percentage of female officers being promoted to senior ranks had increased substantially. Congressional representatives praised the Navy's commitment to change. But the report also documented how much work remained. Subtle bias still existed. Glass ceilings remained in certain communities. The cultural transformation that true equity required was still incomplete. Commander Chen, now Rear Admiral Chen, received a private briefing on the report's findings. She read through the statistics with mixed feelings, satisfaction at progress made, frustration at progress still needed. That evening, she walked the flight deck of USS Theodore Roosevelt alone, reflecting on everything that had transpired. She thought about Admiral Whitmore, living in quiet retirement, his reputation destroyed, his legacy defined by his bias rather than by his decades of service. She thought about Captain Rodriguez, still serving with distinction, his defiance having become legendary. She thought about all the junior officers who had followed her lead, who now understood that excellence and integrity were more important than conforming to institutional expectations. The Navy that had tried to break her had instead been broken by her. The attempt to exclude her had instead forced the institution to confront its own corruption. The exile that was meant to silence her had instead made her a symbol of the need for systemic change. Sometimes institutional transformation requires a catalyst, a moment so undeniable, a crisis so visible, that change becomes inevitable. Commander Chen's removal had been that catalyst. Admiral Whitmore's attempt to exercise absolute authority through bias had instead exposed the rot in the system. Captain Rodriguez's defiance had made it impossible for the Navy to ignore uncomfortable truths. As Rear Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the flight deck of the Roosevelt, watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, she understood that her work was far from complete. But she also understood that the barriers had begun to crumble. The next generation of female officers would have opportunities that had been denied to her generation. They would walk into command positions not because they had to overcome institutional hostility, but because they had been recognized for the merit that had always been there. The Admiral smiled slightly, thinking of the submarine that had surfaced in Defiance, the captain who had risked everything to expose the truth, and the institution that, however reluctantly, had finally begun to change. Sometimes, real transformation requires someone willing to surface from the depths and challenge the darkness above. And sometimes, that sacrifice is worth everything it costs. The end.